Hi, I'm Amy Parsons, president of Colorado State University and host of the Next 150 podcast. We have so many remarkable people in our community, and this is where we're going to hear their stories. We're going to get their perspectives on CSU's next 150 years and gather their very best advice for today's CSU students. Let's get started, Rams. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Next 150. As you can see, we're back in the studio, and we're joined today by two extraordinary members of CSU's creative writing community. Camille Dungy, University Distinguished Professor, and Dan Beachy-Quick, University Distinguished Teaching Scholar. Two decorated English professors here at CSU, accomplished and inspiring poets and authors, important voices in today's writing landscape, and two faculty members I personally greatly admire. Over the last decade, both have been awarded Guggenheim Fellowships, top national honor that recognizes exceptional creative work among artists and writers, along with so many other recognitions for their extraordinary works. I'm so excited for this conversation with them today. Also, April happens to be National Poetry Month, and CSU's creative writing program is celebrating its 40th anniversary this fall, and both poets have just released new books. Thanks, Dan and Camille, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's start with the newest news. You both have new books. Yes. Camille, can you tell us about your new book?
I'd be happy to. So this is a collection of poems called America, a Love Story. And over the past decade or so, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to insist on love in a world that's hard for so many people to practice love, to believe that love is coming their way. And so I wrote a collection of love poems that are also often conscious of a lot of the struggles that we're facing, but give us a space to be held in positive ways.
Well, it sounds amazing. Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
its publication. On a book like that, how long does it take you to put that collection together?
So it has been almost a decade since I published a dedicated collection of poetry. My most recent book was a prose narrative with some poems sprinkled throughout, but it's taken me almost a decade to finish this book.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes. Dan, you have a new book as well?
I do, yeah, out just 4 weeks ago, so very, very brand new in the world at any rate. And it's comprised of three kind of large sections, and the first is a 26 poem long section that imagines each letter of the alphabet as a kind of personal archive, exploring what any given letter kind of calls to mind in terms of associations and memory and, anything. And I do kind of think of each letter as a kind of strange library. And then the second section, is I've been interested for many years in very early philosophy that didn't really have an interest in telling philosophy apart from theology, mythology, natural history, or poetry. And so they're poems that are really trying to get at kind of primary elements of poetic questioning, questions about world and self and earth and syllables and sounds and the different parts of speech. And then the last section is this practice I've had also for about the past decade of just writing poems of gratitude dedicated to former teachers or to friends or family members. The poem is a kind of offering.
What is your process, Dan, of coming up with an idea like that, the alphabet, and using the letters in that way? Where does that come from?
Well, I'd actually gone to a conference in Iceland for nonfiction, and there's a piece there by the artist Ronnie Horn, who does a lot of work throughout her career on water. And there's a work of hers that occupies a building called Library of Water that has these cylinders of water that are melted ice from glaciers that are disappearing. And I just I felt very moved by the thought of finding an archive, a place of memory, a place of restoration, a place to kind find a way to hold on to things that otherwise might depart, as our own memories can. And so I kind of sprang from the inspiration of a visual work to the possibility of a written one, which often has happened to me over the years.
So how long did it take you to end up with the finished product, that from start to finish on the book?
You know, because the archive poem is kind of distinct, and these first philosophy poems were like, it took me 10 years to figure out how to weave all of it together into a book that felt like a book. I just couldn't figure out how to make any of them fit together in a way that didn't feel arbitrary and just willfully done. But finally, I found a way to kind of construct a book that is a book. But it did take 10 years.
Do you both find yourselves working on multiple works at the same time, kind of waiting to see what's going to eventually become a collection and a book in and of itself?
Yes, I have to just answer to the sounds and ideas in my head and let the poems or whatever I'm writing manifest. Oftentimes, I don't quite know where something is going until after it's been written and revised, which we're always teaching our students as well, that the revision process is part of the writing process. And so I try not to ignore anything and write it and discover in that pathway.
Do you feel like you have always been a poet your whole life, or did poetry come to you over time?
Both, but my mother says that I was writing poems and stories before I really was speaking and writing in English, which is my first language. So I needed to clarify that. Maybe I had some other language as well, but so that I was gibberishing my way into poems and writing, and that as I learned how to write, poetry was very often a vessel that felt urgent and absolutely right. So I was lucky to grow up in a household that believed in literature and the importance of poetry and writing in general, and so I didn't have to sneak the process of writing and prove that it was something valid, but it has been something that I've always had an affinity for.
And why do you think poetry for you, as terms of just an art form, what is it that's distinctive about poetry for you?
Honestly, I really like to talk. I'm a pretty loquacious person, and so poetry is a medium that demands that I make careful choices and that I'm really mindful about what I write and how I write it. And I have fewer moments in poetry of, oh my goodness, should I have said that way? Because poetry demands that I really think through what I say and how I say it. So it's a pathway when I was younger of gaining confidence in what I had to say and how I said it, and has helped me in all the rest of my parts of life to feel confident in my choices of language.
Wow. Dan, how about you? Do you feel like you've always been a poet?
You know, I always loved words, loved playing with words. Scrabble was a blood sport in my dad's side of the family, which, heretically enough, called the Unabridged Dictionary the good book. Past the good book was Webster's on that side of the family. But I fell in love, with the dictionary, of looking through words, the sense that the entire possibility of human meaning in a given language is somehow embedded inside this alphabetic order. I mean, it even now kind of fills me with wonder. But it wasn't really until high school where I had a really significant English teacher named Becky Porter, who had studied poetry, who wrote poetry, and was capable of teaching high school students poetry, which I think is a really, really rare gift. And I'll never forget the first time I actually understood a poem was in her class, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning by John Donne. which is a deeply complicated and deeply beautiful poem. And I didn't know a person could make a thing like that. Like, I didn't know it was possible that something could be done with such precision, such care, such vision, such love, such question. And it made me want to do nothing other than try to write a good poem for the rest of my life, which is, I think, pretty much still how I would define what it is I try to do. I'm trying to write a good poem.
You've written a lot of good poems. So when they come to you, I'm just interested how that inspiration strikes you. You use the word manifesting. The poem, do you feel like the poem is out there already and you're the one to bring it into existence, or is it coming up through you into the world, or is it a combination?
It probably depends on the poem. That there definitely are poems that really feel as if whatever language and urgency was there was very, very close to my orbit, and I can just reach out and grab it. But more frequently, it's a wrestling match, and it's a practice. That there's something about very regularly returning to the page, very regularly doing a variety of exercises. I used to train as a musician and an athlete, and the comparisons between doing wall squats and running lines or playing chords, it's very similar. That there's things with language and practice that I have to do over and over again as a muscle memory, so that in those moments when I'm reaching out and there is something really exciting, I have all the other pieces that I need to be able to make that poem really work.
Yeah, I think I've been trying to write poems for 30 plus years now, and it has changed, like the nature of that practice over time. And I think when I was much younger, it had to be a very deliberate and kind of forceful act of kind of clearing space and clearing time and clearing my mind enough to work on a poem has really altered in the last decade or so, where I don't write a poem unless in some way that does feel honestly mysterious to me. I have to come to a first line in a different way than sitting down to write that line, and it usually happens while I'm reading or at a museum or just walking the dog. Like a set of words will come together that catches my attention, like the inner ear feels the quality of a poem. And if that is still there in 2 or 3 days, if I find myself sort of obsessively coming back to this image, this line, this series of sounds, then I write it down and begin, this wrestling that Camille is talking about. Though I've come to a very weird sense of poems, as a very faded kind of space, so that, I think if a first line for me is genuinely a first line of a poem, the entire possibility of the poem is kind of enfolded within it. And so a lot of my writing process is just a lot of patience, a lot of listening to the lines that are written in order to figure out how to create a next honest line. So now it takes me months and months to write a poem. It's also the trouble of that process. But I've come to love the slowness of things.
Well, you've both brought poems to read today, so thank you for being willing to do that. Let's go ahead and hear some. Camille, would you like to start?
I can start.
Is this from the new?
This is from the new book, and so new
Yes.
that I actually do not have the book in hand. So I am
Sneak
reading
preview.
from my tablet to make this happen.
That's wonderful. Thank you for doing that. And Dan, will you be reading from your new book as well? Okay.
I will.
This is so exciting.
One night in 1888, as the French steamboat Abdelkader powered from Marseille to Algiers, news reports proclaim the sky became quite black with swallows. The channel between one life and another has always been subject to sudden explosions. Those swallows must have been exhausted. The birds alighted in the thousands on the sails, ropes, and yards of the Abdelkader. I began with birds, thousands. Some wandered into cabins, ate from passengers' delighted hands. I will return to the birds, but you should know the Abdelkader was named for a man who died 5 years before they blacked the sky around the boat that bore his name. If you don't know how many died, how many more he saved in the decades of conflict between France and Algiers while Abdelkader was emir, maybe you won't know what a wonder this was to report. I read about it in the New York Times. This must have sounded in those days like the stories we hear now of cranes, red-capped, white-napped, who nest nowhere securely but along Korea's demilitarized zone. Those winged strangers remained all night on the vessel, the article claims. In the morning, fed and rested, they flew off for coastal islands still controlled by Spain, which, as you know, once kept as its own our neighbors, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico. I've been trying to write about the Abdelkader swallows for more years than I am able to count. Yesterday, you apologized for arriving late for dinner. You'd seen a small, bent woman walking with heavy bags near the grocery store, and you stopped to ask if she would let you drive her home. You are the size of black man people here consider frightening. The woman must have been exhausted. She settled her body in the cabin, and you carried her safely home. Some days, especially as I'm reminded of how we fight the animals we are, who need to migrate as much as we need to settle, to stay. How we'll tear apart and strand and starve and slaughter that part of us that takes flight from one place to some other. I try to recreate this. A rather curious episode in natural history occurred the other day. The story I love so much begins.
That's remarkable. Thank you for reading that.
Thank you.
Tell us how, there's so many things woven into that. What was the inspiration to bring them together into one thing?
Yeah, I say in the poem that I've been thinking about that news article for more years than I can count. I can count them. It took me 17 years, 1 week, and 4 hours to write that poem.
Oh my gosh.
So it was 17 years of thinking about this newspaper article and keeping the clipping on my desktop and occasionally returning to it because I was just so fascinated by it and never able to figure out how to enter into it. And then I taught a week-long writing workshop where I actually had the students take old drafts of poems that were frustrating them and take scissors and tape and glue and just actually explode them open. And then I came home from that, and a magazine editor asked if I could have a poem for her by the end of the day because she had a really tight deadline and she really wanted something from me. And I had nothing. And I cut up this newspaper article, imaginatively, not with actual scissors, and realized that when I opened the newspaper article up and found out who the figures were in the center of it, and it included other things, and also my husband happened to have been late for dinner.
Conveniently. Inspirationally.
It all really fell into place very, very quickly once I opened up that space for a present realization to sit alongside this old story from 1888.
Wow, it worked beautifully.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing that. What is it like, by the way, to read your own poetry out loud?
Well, part of my answer to the question of have I always known poetry is that in the summers when I would visit my grandparents, one of my tasks that I had to do on Sunday morning was a lot of speaking to the church and reciting verses, and so that kind of public representation of language has always been part of what I've done and what I think I value about how poems sound out loud. That one's a little tricky because I have to say French and and Arabic and a couple other languages and speak species names and things, and so that one is maybe not the safest bet of a public oration, but you go in with confidence. It's the key.
Yeah, that's great. So when you're reading out loud at church and you're reading somebody else's words, that's different from reading your own words that you wrote yourself that are personal and coming from a personal space. So what's going through your mind as you're reading your own words sort of into the public, and now it belongs to the world,
right? Not
just you anymore. It's out there.
Right. I think for one thing, when I'm drafting, I'm thinking about musicality. I'm thinking about the play of words on the tongue. I speak out loud when I'm drafting poems, so I'm always thinking about this as something that will live in the air as well as on the page, so that by the time it gets to the point that a poem is ready to be shared, even if there are more personal, intimate aspects to it, I don't feel vulnerable in that way of sharing. I feel like I'm bringing my whole self and this full truth to the world, and also hopefully something musically engaging and interesting that feels revelatory and honest more than intimate and naked.
Yeah. But there's a bravery in that I imagine inspires a lot of your students as well. Like, you can create this, but then it's not just yours. It should live in the world, right, for other people to experience and to put it out there like you do.
I do believe so. I believe that. And that there should be an element of truth, of honesty. If we're hiding that puts a wall up between readers. I've also been doing this for quite a long time, and so it becomes fascinating what connects with people, and the things that don't feel, to me, didn't feel like a particularly vulnerable thing to have admitted. Somebody will come up and say, nobody's ever said that out loud. I needed to hear that. And then the things that I might have been a little bit afraid or uncertain about sharing, also people will come up and be grateful for that, and then that makes it worthwhile.
Yeah. Does that make you think, oh, that's why I wrote that poem?
It can
that's
feel
why
that way.
came
it can
to me.
really feel that way. It's a wonderful connection.
Yeah. Well, Dan, let's hear from you. You've got a piece ready for us to read.
Yeah. Well, I asked my wife for advice since I've ceased to trust my own instincts in such matters. And she picked out two from this middle section. Both go by the same title. The middle section are three interwoven series, and these are both titled Oracle, A-U-R-I-C-L-E, a word I coined, just thinking about, the prophetic power that the sounds of words can come to us with, and poems really, I think, trying to tune themselves to a kind of musical frequency. Oracle. Your world seems to stand next to the world. Your image waits to be seen. Your night wakes up into another kind of dream. Your body is made of holes you don't know how to fill. eye holes that fill with lightness and that hunger hole. You are the space in which the event called you occurs. To say more is sacrilege, but there are other definitions, you child of wonder. A bee not yours climbs into the open lily of your mind. Oracle. In the car with my mom as a child in the white Ford Escort stick shift, the first car she bought years after the divorce, with a radio unlike the orange Datsun B210 that worked. I remember how the dial glowed when the headlamps turned on, and I would kill the silence when I turned the tuning knob to the right, an amplified click when the speaker stuttered on, and not the music, but the dialing slowly across the frequency. The orange line would, between numbers, find voices just out of reach, just a syllable from grave distances, or a phrase that within the eerie static articulated love or the weather or the victory of the local team, sometimes the names of minor heroes, and sometimes time itself, and sometimes the crime report. And those voices seemed to me to speak from out of some pain I knew existed but could not feel myself, some long ago ever yet to be storm where, blown apart by desire and by desire blown together, the voices needed to tell their story, to be remembered by someone, even a kid, curled up in the dark space beneath the glove compartment, shying away whenever the signal became so strong the song clarified its backbeat in the air, dialing away from the oldies and the news, trying so hard to listen.
Those are extraordinary, Dan. Thank you for reading those.
Yeah, thank you.
Did those both come sort of contemporaneously to you, the two oracles?
No, they were, again, spaced out between amounts of time I can't remember. Many of those poems and the poems in this book were written as my two daughters were growing up, from infancy to young childhood, up into their teen years. So often the you that's addressed is just a really kind of, there's this word in ancient Greek, deinos, that means marvel and wonder at the same time that it means terror or fear. I feel like those poems are written from that absolute contradiction of how you feel seeing your children come into themselves, this wonder and this worry in equal measure, and that can't be really teased apart. And then, in ways like the last poem I read is not a poem I very often write. That's genuinely autobiographical, that's genuinely narrative, but it is, there's something about watching one's own kids that gives you such an inexplicable threshold into memories of your own childhood, and that's where that last poem came from.
How does it feel to you to read a poem like that that's more autobiographical out loud and into the world and into a published book?
I need to gather my friend Camille's larger solidity of self. I think I do feel kind of vulnerable reading poems in a way, and especially those that feel in some ways almost uncomfortably close to me in a certain sense. But I also, understand that my role in reading the poem is to get out of the way of the poem and to just find a voice that speaks it as honestly and potently as I possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it's any... I also had a Datsun B210 in my childhood. So there we go. There's that. I never expected to see a Datsun B210 in a poem.
Nor did I.
We might now need to hear your take on your experience and putting that out into the universe right now. Within the creative writing program at CSU, how do you all work together, support one another, or do you make recommendations to each other? Like, have you heard this person's work? How does that, you have such an extraordinary group over there in CSU's creative writing program. I think it's celebrating 40 years.
40
this
years
year,
this
which
fall.
is remarkable. 3 Guggenheim Fellows on this faculty alone, of course, along with Matthew Cooperman receiving his just this year. So talk about that program. What's the culture like within CSU's creative writing program?
Just kind of speaking of the 4 poets, including Sasha Steenson, we're all dear friends, which I think is really rare in a certain sense. We're all poets that practice the art differently in ways that I think are really like genuinely beneficial to each other as artists and to the ways that in which we teach our students. They're different, but they're complementary. I feel an immense gratitude to learn so deeply from my colleagues. I enjoy the humbleness I feel as I hear all of them, any of them, speak about what it is they're doing on the page, how it is they're thinking, what it is they're reading, what they're hoping for from a next class. And I think that that genuine collegiality, that sense of friendship, that sense of being bonded in a shared experiment, this possibility of making 3 years of graduate study of poetry or creative nonfiction or fiction genuinely meaningful for our students, not just in the 3 years that they're in the program, but far more powerfully, that this is a practice that they'll have for the rest of their life that helps them live that life more decently. That good ethic spreads itself throughout the entire program. It's a really, really remarkable place to teach and for people to come and study. All the more so that all of us, I think, hold teaching as one of the highest ideals for our art that one can possibly hold. And I think that's really different from other places that have a very esteemed faculty, that we care deeply about our students.
I think the one thing that I would add to what Dan says is to expand on a point that he made, that we all write differently. And this feels very important as professors and practitioners, that there's space for so many modes of expression, so many ways of coming to poetry, coming to any of the kinds of literature that we work with in the creative writing program. And it gives our students and ourselves this opportunity to really be expansive in the ways that we show up in the world. And so it's just a pleasure to be with my colleagues and just see what they're up to, right?
Yeah.
To read Nina's novel and then on Wednesday, get to go and see her play and see all of these different possibilities for how imagination can turn into language and then can go walking into the world doing real work. It's exciting to be with people who are actively participating in something as vibrant as that.
Yeah, well, and how fortunate are our students to come into this environment and to be able to learn from all of you. You two especially are both known as great mentors to students and really caring mentors to students. Obviously, student success is what we live for at CSU. So interested to hear how you might mentor a new student just coming in who says, I think I'm a poet, right? And I want to nurture this and do this in my life. What advice do you give to those students?
After saying hooray, welcome, it's safe here. I really like to encourage students reading so that they're reading robustly and widely and seeing all these different kind of possibilities for what they can do. I like to talk to students about all of the variety of applications that literature has in the world and the kinds of connections that we're able to make through literature with many other disciplines. And so reminding students that being in love with something like poetry does not mean that they have to be siloed off and not connected to science or politics or economics, that poetry is capacious and has room for you to be doing and thinking in lots and lots of different ways. And so it becomes for me a really wonderful space for meditation, but I think for me a very connected kind of meditation, and just being able to remind students over and over again that choosing poetry does not mean that you are entering some sort of disappeared convent where they can't be connected with the living world in really exciting and vibrant ways.
To hear you explain it, I think maybe I asked the question in reverse. Maybe it should be a scientist or somebody out there who should be, anybody can be a poet. Maybe igniting the poet within them if they feel like it's off limits to them. Like, no, it's not off limits to anybody. Right?
It should not be off limits to anybody.
You can find your inner poet.
It should not be off limits to
It's that
anybody.
capacious, to use your word, that anyone can find it.
A connection in through reading or writing or both. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Dan, how about you? Advice for either the person who says, I'm a poet, or the person who says, I'm not a poet. I could never be a poet. I'm a scientist or something else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love those conversations, actually, and convincing those from whatever field, for whatever reason, that poetry isn't something they're able to do, to help make that a possibility. I mean, poems are fearful for people. They're difficult. It's a strange art. It bewilders one. But I love it when the French poet Paul Valéry says that all a poet needs is infinite connection to their childhood. Like, you know, there's just this there's a lovely way to remind people that they're still capable of the very wonder that poetry depends upon to exist. And, you know, I think I very much follow suit with Camille, not just applauding the person who says, I think I might be a poet, to which I say, I think I might be one too, which is true. It's, you know, I'm still really trying hard to be a poet. To set them forth on reading and the kind of reading that the poem that they'll share with me suggests. I mean, one of the real powers of poetry, and I think a necessity to practice it in a serious way, is you have to kind of figure out your lineage. You have to find your ancestors. And part of the real beauty of being involved in poetry in the way, you know, all of us have been for so many years is you find yourself an inheritor of a kind of thinking and a kind of practice that has occurred over many, many generations, sometimes stretching back across thousands of years. And to make students feel how long-lived this art is, how the cares that kind of can torment us with the feeling of being unprecedented now have ample precedence in the history of human crisis and human consciousness, that we're not as alone as we feel and fear we might be alone. Poetry's a profound reminder of that, a comfort, if we learn how to let it be a comfort to us. And then I really try to help students learn how to read their own poems. Like, in the end, the only teacher I think any poet has is the poems they themselves are writing. It's a strange but true irony. And so you're not always going to have a mentor to bring a poem to and say, what do you see? You have to be able to do that work yourself. And so, you know, I really see that as like the threshold of someone becoming a poet, is when they know how to read their poem by its own light rather than what they had hoped or feared about it. They have to be able to learn from their own poems. And if they can manage to do that, they're going to be fine.
Well, Dan and Camille, our time went by way too fast. In this interview, I could sit here all day and talk to you about your work, and my hope is that every student at CSU gets to intersect with you and the creative writing program at some point at CSU, because it's so remarkable and so important. I'm a big fan of both of yours, and congratulations on your new books. Thanks for spending some time with me today and reading your poetry out loud. It's been truly an honor.
Thanks for having us here.
So thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks all for joining us today. Go Rams. Thank you for listening. I'm Amy Parsons, president of Colorado State University, and you're listening to CSU's The Next 150, where we explore what comes next for CSU by chatting with change makers who are already leading the charge and shaping our next 150 years. I'm gathering their very best advice for today's CSU students. Stay tuned to wherever you get podcasts for our next outstanding conversation. Go Rams!